Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Josh Gad's dog has a new purpose in a dog's journey. Starting where the first left off, faithful dog Bailey, voiced by Josh Gad, is happily reunited with his old owner Ethan Montgomery, played by Dennis Quaid, and his wife Hannah, played by Mark Helgenberger, her daughter Gloria, played by Betty Gilpin, and Hannah's baby granddaughter CJ. But after a rift divides the family, and as Bailey's current life comes to an end, Ethan tells Bailey to take care of CJ in his next incarnation, which is exactly what he does, going on new adventures in more new lives, each time determined to find and protect CJ as she grows up, played by Abby Ryder-Fortson at 11 and Catherine Prescott as an adult. A Dog's Journey is based on W. Bruce Cameron's 2012 book of the same name, which of course is a sequel to his highly successful A Dog's Purpose, which was adapted to a film in 2017 that made $200 million worldwide. Now I know what you're probably thinking, didn't we already get a sequel to that movie? What you're likely thinking of is A Dog's Way Home, which is actually a Sony movie that was released a few months ago based off another W. Bruce Cameron book. In fact, he co-wrote the screenplays adapting all three. Clearly Mr. Cameron has managed to work out a fairly sizable living writing stories from dogs' perspectives, although some might cynically describe that as essentially writing the same story 3 times. Now I watched A Dog's Purpose for the sake of this review, and it's best described as Marley and Me meets the dog reincarnation flick Fluke. I wasn't a fan of it. That's in large part because I've recently lost a pet, so that's still very raw, and I found the movie to be a really difficult watch in places, to be honest. Although, even if I didn't have that, I'd still think that movie is incredibly emotionally manipulative, even by the standards of tearjerkers, because to have a narrative where dogs die repeatedly over the course of it, it's borderline cruel, quite frankly. Watching a pet die or watching any loved one pass is one of the hardest things anyone has to go through. So to simulate that time and time again, just to get an emotional response, that genuinely made me a little bit angry. I didn't find the film uplifting, it actually made me a bit miserable overall. And so I genuinely wasn't looking forward to sitting down to seeing this sequel, but I know there are a lot of people that did like A Dog's Purpose, and if you're one of those people, great! Because A Dog's Journey is essentially the same thing. A Dog's Journey picks up where the last one left off, sort of. One of the oddest things about this movie is the way that it retcons its own timeline. So if you saw A Dog's Purpose, you'll know that it spans several decades. It went from the 60s up to what appeared to be the present day, where Bailey reunites with Ethan in its final scenes. But not according to A Dog's Journey, which now pretends those scenes were in the 90s. I guess the filmmakers suddenly realised, oh, well if this story continues for 2 decades, we'll be in the future. We gotta push everything back. So they communicate that to the audience by having Gloria walk in one of the very earliest scenes with this vintage late 90s mobile phone, one of those bricks that opens up and has an extendable antenna. And that was completely bewildering to me as I suddenly went, what time frame are we even in right now? And the film does a fairly good job of continuing the field that Lasse Hallström set up in the previous entry. He's been replaced as director by Gail Mancuso, who is a very storied TV director. She's worked in that field for decades, helming pretty much everything. In fact, a classic episode of Friends that she directed pops up very briefly, but she's making her feature film debut here. But generally speaking, the film does feel a little bit more TV-esque, and I think that's because it plays more broadly. There's more pee and poo jokes here, but this is particularly true with the way that it deals with its subject matters. A Dog's Purpose mixed cute animal action with fairly dark themes like alcoholism and kidnapping, and A Dog's Journey doubles down on that because we get more alcoholism, an abusive drug dealer boyfriend, and chemotherapy over the course of its running time, none of which I think the film is truly equipped to deal with, and often plays so broadly they feel like they could be individual Lifetime TV movie dramas. This is particularly true of the way the film handles the alcoholism subplot with Gloria. Oh my goodness, that is a combination of really flowery writing and an OTT performance by Betty Gilpin. I understand that the character is this aspiring singer retreating into her own bitterness because she lost her lover before the birth of her child, but she quickly escalates into someone that is only seen on screen either being drunk or holding a wine glass in her hand or a margarita. And that's not even mentioning the fact that she frequently leaves her child overnight while she goes out with a succession of men. CJ essentially has to fend for herself most nights. She is negligent to an almost comical degree. Frankly, you wonder how child services haven't been called. And there is a very late attempt to try and reconcile that character, to try and maybe bring her back down to something resembling a human being, but that's very late in the movie, and it certainly doesn't wipe away the faults with the performance. One of my problems with these movies, they deal with such grim topics. These are meant to be family movies, and I know what they're meant to do. They're meant to be targeted towards the youngest end of the audience to prepare them for bereavement. I understand that. But surely they won't have much interest in, say, a subplot about alcoholism, about parental neglect. It seems like that audience is mostly there to see the animal action, and that's not really the focus of a lot of either of these movies. So I just find that very, very peculiar, and surely there's a better way of doing that than subjecting them to a 100-minute misery mill. You've got dogs dying all over the place, which is heavy enough, but then you've got what the characters go through, which is essentially a succession of tragedies. It really feels almost overwhelming at points. And the wildly inconsistent tone really isn't helped by Josh Gad's performance. Now, I find Gad to be a bit of a grating presence sometimes, but especially so in these movies that call upon to be really shrill and high-pitched and excited and exuberant all the time as he spouts the cod infantile dialogue. The way the dog is written is he's got some limited understanding of the wider human world, but everything else is very narrow, very simplified, almost childlike in a lot of ways. And that's because it's meant to be playing towards the younger members of the audience, the ones that will find it hilarious when he mentions how much he loves being fed bacon. But older audience members will find that that will get on their nerves very quickly. And that's even more so in this sequel, because in the first film there were moments where he was having what appeared to be an existential crisis, trying to work out why he was here. There's much less of that in this movie, so essentially it's cut to the dog for a laugh line again and again and again. What do people love about dogs? Have him say it again and again and again. And sometimes it feels like Gad is just narrating the story for the sake of the audience. It's not like the signifiers in this movie are particularly complex. They pretty much give all the plot points in the broadest terms possible, but even if you didn't pick that up, they'll have Bailey walk over and go, "I don't like the smell of that person." In case you hadn't got the hint yet, it feels like it's speaking down to the audience to the point where it starts getting frustrating. But even worse, at times it's just straight out inappropriate. So obviously, the movie is dealing with some sensitive topics, and this is especially true with the cancer subplot, and yet, even in the midst of that, the film is still cutting to Bailey for comic relief, which I understand, it's meant to bring some levity to the movie, but when the character's going through chemotherapy, maybe not have a moment where you cut to Bailey as he wonders, why aren't they doing the face licking thing? Time and place, maybe. Time and place. Maybe that would be a moment to actually be sincere as opposed to trying to play a little bit for comedy even in a dark moment. But the movie never does that. It always has to punctuate a scene with Josh Gad's voiceover. And a lot of this movie's problems comes down to the fact that it's simply unnecessary. It's an epilogue onto a story that has largely resolved itself. Bailey found his purpose in the last movie, which, if you recall, was to be there, and that's exactly what he is here. He's there. The story just takes place around him in this movie. He has no arc, he has no character growth, he has an objective in place of those things, to find and follow CJ. She's the one that changes over the course of the story, which is fine, but the movie seems totally confused about what perspective it's trying to offer. Sometimes it doesn't seem like Bailey is really doing anything in the film at all. It feels like he could be almost edited out of the movie and nothing would change about it. And even more confusingly, the film suddenly reverts back to its original focus in the middle, because A Dog's Purpose was essentially an anthology story. It followed various different owners and lives over the course of it as the times changed. I found that to be at least fairly interesting. It almost felt like the movie changed genres at one point in the original. No such luck in A Dog's Journey, which almost totally abandons that concept. The one time that it suddenly reverts back to it is really underdeveloped. In his middle life, Bailey gets reincarnated as Big Dog, and the lazy name gives you an indication of just how much they're not really paying attention to this particular plot line. He's born to a store owner, and he's just waiting around until CJ wanders into the shop one time and then never comes back again. And then I guess he gets old and gets tired of waiting, so he just wanders into the woods behind the shop and dies. There's no real conclusion to it. It just stops and just moves on to the next life all of a sudden, and it just shows how much the movie doesn't even care about its original conceit. And I don't like the idea now that Bailey is just reincarnated perpetually in the periphery of CJ's life over and over again. I mean, admittedly, the original concept for the film of a dog eventually making its way back to its original owner over the course of several lifetimes is a real stretch, but I can just about buy it. But man, does this movie just pile on the coincidences over and over again. Like, it really begins to stretch the credibility of the fantasy world. Oh, suddenly her love interest has showed up in New York. How convenient! It just feels really lazy from a screenwriting perspective, and when you're doing this, maybe not call attention to it. Dennis Quaid shows back up again at the end of the movie, and Ethan in this film has almost comically started believing that every dog that he sees is the reincarnation of Bailey. He's always going, "Is that you, boss dog?" And at the end of the film, he has a frankly hilarious moment where he explains the plot of the first movie to CJ, and he sounds like an absolute lunatic, because it is really that preposterous and that far-fetched. That also brings me to another bit of weirdness that I have with the entire concept of both of these movies, in that the way they approach reincarnation is very puzzling. So Bailey, no matter what life that he's leading, he's always Bailey, no matter what. He is the same. Even when he's in the body of a girl, the movie even recycles the joke from the first movie of, "Oh, I'm a girl," not with any flip on it. It's literally the same joke. But that just brings up a whole other list of things, like, okay, isn't the whole point of reincarnation is that you're brought back with a clean slate? You don't remember who you are, and aren't people and living things shaped by their own experiences, who they are, how they were raised, what happened to them, essentially? A Dog's Purpose and A Dog's Journey ignore that completely. Bailey retains everything that he's learnt from his previous lives, especially tricks, that actually becomes a plot point in both of these movies, and yet it doesn't seem like he grows that much wiser over the course of the story. And I understand what this is meant to be. It's meant to be a reassuring fantasy for dog owners, particularly young ones. It's meant to be saying, oh, that new dog that you've got, it's your old dog, but in a new body. It's the same dog. But it just raises so many questions. The internal logic of it doesn't hold up to any real scrutiny whatsoever. A Dog's Journey is exactly what you'd expect from a sequel. The only reason that it exists is because it's pre-assessed success, not because it has any more story to tell. If you liked A Dog's Purpose, if you want to spend more time with Bailey and his world, you may well enjoy this, but it is a pretty much straight rehash of the first film, borderline soft remake, and if you're a newcomer, I can't recommend either of these movies. I think there are better movies that deal with the subjects of grief and bereavement and handle that for a younger audience that don't involve using dog deaths as emotional castle prods. Especially because in this film there are 3 instances where they CGI dog eyes so they look into the camera in their final moments. They are that shameless about getting a response from the audience. And I generally speaking think that these movies don't really entertain the family crowds. They deal with fairly heavy subjects that I don't think will appeal to younger audiences, and I was certainly getting that feeling from the audience that I was watching it with. I saw it with a lot of families in attendance, and the kid behind me actually at one point said, "This is sad," which probably goes to show how much he wasn't enjoying the movie. And quite frankly, he was right. It is sad. Make that kid a critic. A Dog's Journey is a sequel that is literally more of the same, following the general rhythm of A Dog's Purpose in a slightly different framework. Once again, the film is a very awkward mixture of cutesy dog antics and bittersweet melodrama that feels tonally inconsistent, not helped by Josh Gad's clawing, relentlessly upbeat voiceover. The major change to focus on a single character rather than multiple owners and lives stretches the credibility of the film's fantasy logic to breaking points as it puts out one coincidence after another. Like its predecessor, Journey is shameless in its attempts to tug at our heartstrings as we see dogs die over and over again in cynical and calculated fashion, and what should be a hopefully uplifting adventure is actually a surprisingly dark, downbeat trek that will likely leave families miserable. If you like this review, then you can play fetch over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.